Hey, everybody. Welcome to Red May 2025, our 9th Red May. This year's festival is dedicated to the memory of our friend Joshua Clover, poet, wit, lucid and courageous communist. Ave et quae Joshua. Okay. Today I'm happy to at least broach the topic of where we are, how we got here, and where we're going. And it's called Some Way Out of Here, in homage to Bob Dylan's song, There Must Be Some Way Out of Here. And to help us figure out if there is, or what it might be, we have some of Red May's alums back here, and some people who have never been at Red May before. Jasper Bernes, who is the author of the wonderful new book, The Future of Revolution. We're having, by the way, if you are in Seattle on May 29th, Thursday, May 29th, at 7:30 p.m. at Town Hall, Seattle, we're having a discussion about that with Jasper in the flesh. Jasper is also a poet and author of We Are Nothing and So Can You. He was one of the principals of Commune Editions and is also the author of The Work of Art in the Age of Deindustrialization. Alberto Toscano, across the border in Canada, safe for the moment. Alberto is the author of so many books. It's of such variety. Or editor of them. He's the author of Fanaticism on the Uses of an Idea, Cartographies of the Absolute, and of course, Late Fascism, Race Capitalism, and Politics of Crisis from Verso in 2023, and another book we love called Terms of Disorder. He's the editor of the Italian line in Seagull Press, which has brought out books by Franco Fortini, Fulvio Gessi, and he's the editor now of a 2-volume Georges Bataille collected writings, which is just absolutely incredible as you look at it. If I had the money in my pocket then, I would have just snatched it up, but it's at the top of the list. We're happy to have also Jodi Dean. Jodi is the author of Neo-Feudalism. Let me get the exact title. Capital's Grave, Neo-Feudalism and the New Class Struggle, but many of you will know her as the author of the what I call the Communist Trilogy, The Communist Horizon, Crowds and Party, The Comrade from Verso. Or at least the last two are. But although some books you might not know that are early, but quite fascinating to read now, Blog Theory, Aliens in America. And last we have Michael McCarthy, a critical sociologist who is the author of a new book called The Master's Tools, How Finance Wrecked Democracy and a Radical Plan to Rebuild It. We want to have a discussion about that and about finance at one of our perhaps mini Red Mays. Hopefully we might have a Red October this year. But we're all here to kind of share our bewilderment, our illumination at the present moment, and to kind of decide for ourselves whether it is in fact a unique moment, not in the way that every moment is a unique moment, but it's something that no one expected, it's a surprise, or were the signs for this sitting by the roadside for anybody to look at for a long, long time? And what particularly is this in the first 100 days of Trump? And then not to get too imprisoned in the back and forth of TV news events, and to at least attend to what's structurally going on over the long term, to try to figure out where we might be headed and what we might do as members of the left. It's going to be fairly informal. Some people have prepared remarks. Others are just want to go into it conversationally. So I thought we'd start with Jodi here and give us your take. I mean, the questions we pose, there are things like what's novel about this new regime in the first 100 days? What, if anything, has surprised you about the response or the non-response of the media, the political class, friends and relatives to the scale of this counter-revolution? And then afterwards, how do we move forward? So throwing those questions up in the air, we'll go to Jodi.
Great. Thanks so much, Philip. I want to focus my questions on how did we get to this point? And I was thinking about this in terms of, are we in a situation where the problem is the weakness of the left, or might it be a response to the strength of the left? And at first, when I first was thinking about your questions, I kept thinking about this primarily in terms of left defeat, the destruction of democracy as the culmination of the defeat of the Soviet Union and the working class after 40 years of neoliberalism. And so the kind of sad, depressing story of left failure and division, our inability to fight back effectively or respond to changes in capitalism, our inability to come up with enough of a common program to fight for state power, and instead ceding the term to the right, the whole terrain to the right. But increasingly I started thinking that this is a really unsatisfying answer, in part because it doesn't mesh with the right's own narrative about left-wing takeover. Across the right, from the Catholics through MAGA to the tech bros, there's this story of radical left takeover of the country, right? People probably saw recently Trump complaining about communist judges, right? As if that were the case. In fact, the judges that he appointed under the suggestions of Leonard Leo and the Federalist Society, hardly communist judges, but that's what they're complaining about. And then think of another set of complaints. I'm going to think about these in a little more detail from Mark Andreessen. He was the founder of Netscape, and he's a Silicon Valley venture capitalist. And he did this interview a few months ago with Ross Douthat in the New York Times. And Andreessen tells a story of the radical left takeover of Silicon Valley. Leftist employees flooded tech companies. They pushed DEI and socially responsible investing. Far left Democrats were cracking down on crypto and trying to hamstring the development of AI. In Andreessen's telling, the whole period from the second Obama administration through Trump 1 and Biden is a story of the dramatic expansion of left power. And he gives in particular the years 2012, 2013, and 2014 as like this kind of major problem. Like this is when everything is going wrong. And he says, like just a few years before that, Harvard graduates were coming to Silicon Valley, ready to make money, wanting to get promoted, wanting to be CEOs. But by 2012, Andreessen says, they're coming in with the attitude of fuck it. We're burning the system down. You are all evil. White people are evil. All men are evil. Capitalism is evil. Tech is evil. That's a quote. Andreessen doesn't mention the protest against the Google shuttle buses in San Francisco that happened that year, or the broader rise in critical commentary at the time, right, on tax avoidance by tech lords, their personal excesses, the concomitant stagnation of the sector. Nor does he mention the rise of Black Lives Matter with the Ferguson rebellions in 2014, or Israel's war in Gaza happening at the same time, right? Operation Protective Edge, where Israel killed over 2,000 Palestinians. Instead, Andreessen's story is about misunderstood and disrespected founders and CEOs feeling bad because nobody likes them anymore, and they have to deal with these radicalized employees, activists, and by 2017, a Democratic Party that was blaming big tech for Trump and demanding some kind of social media accountability. In Andreessen's words, and then, of course, COVID hits, which was a giant radicalizing moment. And at that point, we had lived through 8 years of what was increasingly, clearly a social revolution. Very clearly, companies are being hijacked to engines of social change, social revolution. The employee base is going feral. There were cases in the Trump era where multiple companies I know felt like they were hours away from full-blown violent riots on their own campuses by their own employees. In Andreessen's world, which I think we should take as an indication of thinking on the right, radicals are poised to destroy their companies. He repeatedly says in this interview, they're going to kill us, kill our companies, and that their only plea is, please don't kill us. Now, we might evaluate this in terms of Andreessen's like psychotic inability to distinguish between what is happening to others and what is happening to him. Images of riots and violence blur into the organized fight back of workers in the tech sector, such that Andreessen and his ilk become the victims. But I think he's right. The goal is to bring them down, to demolish the power of the tech lords, billionaires, capitalists, and asset holders, their whole racist, climate-destroying, neo-feudal imperialist order. That's the horizon. As Andreessen says, the left wants revolution, and the right wants not the left. If we combine Andreessen's fear of riots and revolution with the 2020 George Floyd protest, right, which involved nearly 30 million people, many demonstrating for the very first time, and then if we combine this with the last year and a half of Palestinian solidarity protests and encampments, it makes sense that the ruling class is afraid. By their terms, we are going feral, refusing to put up and shut up. In 2020, millions called for the defunding and abolition of the police. Since 2023, millions around the world have consistently demonstrated against Israeli occupation and genocide and against the complicity of the US, UK, and EU in perpetrating the genocide. Not only is support for Palestine stronger than it's ever been in the US, but we see every day the willingness of people, especially students, to fight back even when they're facing great personal risk. So how did we get to the Trump era? It's counter-revolution against left strength. It's right-wing flip out against DEI, disorder, and Democrats who are all presented as communists. Okay, 2 more points. Second, if we assess the present right-wing flip out in terms of ruling class fear of radical left power, we can account for a couple of other aspects of it. It explains the capitulation and cowardice of Columbia and other universities, the concessions of major law firms to Trump's extortionate demands, and the cooperation and compliance of the Democratic Party with an administration that they labeled as fascist. The liberal establishment is afraid, and they're so afraid that they're turning against their own stated purposes and ideals. The very real problems with decaying capitalism on a warming planet, right, from increases in immigration to intensified economic inequality, to the end of US hegemony, to imperial violence, this heightens the contradictions, the sides becoming clearer. Now, the so-called rights and guarantees of liberal democracy have, of course, always been conditional, but that doesn't mean they're not useful. It's better not to be at risk of deportation for writing an editorial or participating in campus protests. It's better not to lose one's job because of one's political activity. It's better not to have it is better to have school curricula that tell the truth about settler colonialism, slavery, lynching, and Jim Crow. Third point, that the ruling class flip out is a response to left strength must not preclude acknowledgement of our weakness. That is, acknowledgement of the limits of that the last cycle of struggles have come up against with respect to imperial economic and state power. The billionaires have gotten richer. Police violence has expanded. Over 50,000 Palestinians have been killed. Much of Gaza reduced to rubble. And Israel is bombing Syria and Lebanon and preparing to annex the West Bank, and of course, climate change. So we have to seek truth from facts. We have not built the power to stop any of this, but that's the task. We have to prepare the revolution they fear, building the organizations and movements with the capacity to strategize, to seize, and to transform the state and socialize production and distribution. The rejection of the status quo is already here. The challenge is the direction that comes next. In the more immediate term, we can't fall for the liberal trick of defending a rotten, decaying system. In his new book, Perfect Victims, Muhammad El-Kurd writes that this consequential moment calls on us to raise the ceiling of what is permissible. We answer that call when we reject safetyism, nonviolence, vulnerability, moralism, and identity deference as the default settings of our organizing. Embracing weakness is not the way to build strength. It's not the path to revolution, even if it is a well-worn path to academic recognition. If we believe our analyses, something Charisse Burden-Stelly always calls for, then we need to acknowledge that business is over as usual, past security is gone, an armed struggle with all its risk and complexity is resistance, and resistance is justified. We have to figure out how to link the political struggle with subsistence and survival struggles without assuming that these are the same or competing or that they have to be done by a single organization. Struggles in the hinterlands, right, in rural and abandoned areas are ongoing and will continue to escalate, right? Building there and decreasing the urban-rural divide is crucial, and it's actually already happening with the immigration struggle. Most important, building and expanding the socialist and communist movement rather than being content with tiny cultural formations is part of the order of the day. So whatever weakness we have is on us. Our failure to provide the language for expressing working class grievance and the organization and to build the organizations needed for working class struggle. Anyway, I conclude, if we want revolution, we have to think like it, act like it, and prepare for it. Anything else is liberalism.
Thanks a lot, Jodi. I mean, there's a lot there, a lot of questions that you posed that are worth dealing with. And before we go into the next person, the question I would ask, one question is, obviously, from one perspective, it's a phantasmagoria. It's something out of Ernst Bloch to believe that Joe Biden is a Marxist and the Marxists control the government. And yet the question is, some of these people obviously believe it. Some people pretend to believe it. Some people act like it's happening so they'll maintain influence in Washington, D.C. It's a really complicated situation here where you have something that both is accepted as true and is obviously crazy that we're looking at from the outside. And that has to do with the imminence of revolution and lots of other things. So I wonder how that factors in. You know, obviously the tech people have this narrative that's going to send them to Mars. You know, that means that essentially Earth is going to be so bad that all the perils of forming a civilization on Mars will be easier for the rich people than sort of cleaning up the ecological mess here, or capitalism's mess. So I guess, I'm thinking about Alberto's late fascism book and also, the question of Bloch's Heritage of Our Times, that kind of strange mix of kind of archaic thought and actual belief, and wondering how people sense, it factors in here. Does anybody have does that lead in that naturally to what somebody was going to say on these topics?
Maybe I can chime, because it sort of does chime in with what I was going to say anyhow. So maybe I'll use my time now and then pass it on to Mike, who I think had some semi-prepared comments as well as Jodi. So I think one of the questions that I think is key that was raised in Jodi's intervention is really about how we understand the very vocabulary and the very idea of counter-revolution today. It's striking that it is a term, it is a lexicon that's part of the terminology of the US far right and the far right elsewhere. How much this is, as in Jodi's galvanizingly optimistic interpretation, a symptom of left strength, and how much is it, as Adorno said of the far right in Germany in 1967, an imago of communism? is I think up for debate. When I was working on the book, I thought that two formulations, regarding fascism emerging from Black radical and communist struggles in the US could be merged together, right? The first one being Du Bois's understanding of the counter-revolution against radical reconstruction as the counter-revolution of property, right? And the second one being Angela Davis's and Marcuse's formulation of a preventive counter-revolution. And I think that temporality, but also that strategic as well as psychic landscape of the preventive is quite important, right? So if we think of something like a preventive, a long, very long preventive counter-revolution of property as a sort of thread, right, running through this. And I think here maybe we can also speculate about the nature of these fantasies and misrecognitions, right? So why is it that very explicitly from, as Jodi rightly said, right, from the venture capitalists and tech bros to the radical Christian nationalists, social conservatives like Russell Vogt, this narrative, right, in Vogt's terms, that we are in the late stage of a Marxist takeover of the state, has become so pervasive. And why is it that mechanisms of co-optation, compromise, the pacification of struggle, right, are misrecognized, right, as a systematic and strategic plot by a supposedly radical left to embed itself in all of the apparatuses of the state, down to, the Department of Defense, the military, the repressive apparatus, and so on. So I think we have, to my mind, there's two elements. One is that this is a kind of screen as well as a much more manageable tactical object vis-a-vis the trauma, or the number of traumas, but the trauma that was the George Floyd uprising, right? And the possibilities opened up by that, which of course, many of these mechanisms that are presented as Marxist Trojan horses were fairly deliberately aimed to pacify, right? To kind of co-opt and pacify. The other aspect, though, which I think is really critical and that I would want to center in this conversation, is the real rationality, the realpolitik that relies in the idea of prevention. And we talk about the preventive or the anticipatory element. If we do so, I think we need to keep in mind that there is a recognition, sometimes explicit, sometimes subterranean, on the part of the far right, that extreme, widespread, and rather uncontrollable social struggles are inevitable, right? Are inevitable due to geopolitical conflict, economic stagnation, climate collapse, and so on, right? And so the preventive dimension, I think, of this fascistic counter-revolution of property is really about, and sometimes this is made very explicit, is really about systematically eliminating any capacities for organization or self-defense or coordination amongst social forces that would be viewed as arrayed against the prospects and projects of capital or of social conservatism, right? I think here of Elsa Dorland's great book on the philosophy of self-defense, right? This is a logic that's key to fascism, that is key to racial capitalism, which is a logic of eliminating the very capacity for self-defense, right? And this is where we see the extreme overkill, in literally, of the militarization of the state. And this is where we also see, I think, the lucidity of Gustavo Petro's statement that what we see in Gaza is a rehearsal for the future, right? And this is why there's such a participation and a buy-in and a complicity and an infrastructural support for it. So that's what I would want to really, like, in light of Jodi's comments, I think what is being responded to in many ways is a potential and is also a prospect of real crisis, about which I think the far right is much more realistic and much more lucid than much of the left, which I think even in some of its self-avowed radical variants imagines the situation to be much more containable or much more reformable. And just to finish up, I think this is why I think the right has the ability to plug into what Adorno 60 years ago called this widespread feeling of social catastrophe, right? The anxiety of imminence of what is coming, but I think is also what lies behind, I think, what not just the genocide in Gaza, but also the response to the solidarity and the protests has shown, which is a complete moral, symbolic collapse of progressive neoliberalism, lesser evilism, and so on, right? That are now, I think, dead men walking, even though they might still get 60, 70 million people to vote for them. So I'm not doubting that, but I think there is that kind of hollowing out that we have to reckon with, right? In thinking about the ways out. So I'll stop there and pass it on to Mike, I think.
Well, wait, let's, anybody want to respond to that quickly? We'll get to you, Mike, don't worry. I mean, it's a crazy idea. It's a reaction to events that are going to happen years down the road,
Well, and I think maybe just to add to that, I think there's this element which I think is also very significant, is the systematic and lucid character of the various wings of the far right's deliberate decision to take, break, and remake the state, right? And that's where also I think the use of those executive mechanisms that were, of course, totally normal also under democratic administrations for all sorts of nefarious material as well, that becomes really key, right? And we see this also, right, in the spectacle of cruelty that goes along with the mass deportations and the repression. I think that that kind of neo-Caesarist explicit dictatorship of capital becomes quite significant.
Okay, we'll get back to that. Mike, you want to step in and give us a couple of?
Yeah, I guess in the spirit of riffs, I'm going to just throw my comments out completely and kind of go off what was previously said, because both Alberto and Jodi's comments resonate in important ways. The way I see it is that, starting around 2015, 2016, there was a real acceleration in social movement activity, not just in the US, but around the world, that I think made incredible strides on the cultural level, that in pretty deep and profound ways eroded the legitimacy of the ruling class, of the figures of the elite who kind of who we see on social media and in our newspaper pages. And my sense of things is that the Trump election in particular, and the kind of extreme machismo that came out of folks like Elon Musk and the rest of the tech capitalists was a real kind of was an expression of what they thought as regaining their cultural power, regaining their cultural position in society, regaining their cultural legitimacy. And I think that especially as Black Lives Matter emerged, a lot of that legitimacy was drastically eroded. I mean, we saw huge changes in the way that young people thought about socialism, thought about the elite, the way that ordinary working class people think about large firms, big banks. There was massive cultural shift. There wasn't a massive shift politically. There wasn't a massive shift in terms of economic redistribution. There wasn't a massive shift in terms of development of working class institutions, but there was a shift in terms of cultural perceptions of the elite and of their institutions. And I think that was too much for them to handle. And so what we've seen in this kind of moment of this, I think Alberto is absolutely right to kind of trace this kind of fascist turn in these kind of racial moments is I think what they experience as a reassertion of their cultural power. But that was never attached to in any way a loss of economic power, right? It was the movements that kind of were thrown up didn't make real genuine inroads in terms of redistribution. So I kind of riffing off what Alberto and Jodi said, I think that's kind of how I see the background of this moment. There were cultural gains made, and those were made by the left, made by progressive movements, and what we're seeing is essentially a reaction to those things on the part of the elite. But then the question is, where's this project now? What is it looking like now that we're 100 days in past their the celebratory win? I think, frankly, I think if this is an emergent fascism, I think it's fragile, unformed, and in crisis, actually. And what we've seen now is a kind of breakdown in the coalition that put Trump in office, that put sort of this project on the winning tracks. And I think you can see this basically on both sides. So on the side of the working class, but also on the side of the elite. So on the side of the working class, if you look at the opinion polls right now, the presidency is completely underwater. There's huge disapproval ratings, and they've literally gone down ever since the first day that he was in office. It's been like a literal downward trend in approval ratings day after day. There was never a bump up, right? It's constantly down and getting worse. And people disapprove how Elon Musk is handling the Doge department. They disapprove about how the economy is running. Huge numbers. 75% think the economy is crap right now. People disapprove the tariff plan. They think the administration is going too far, breaking laws. The one thing that Trump did have majority approval on when he was elected was on deportations. There was a slight majority that wanted increased deportations. Even on that front, because of the extrajuridical ways in which the administration is pursuing those, people are now increasingly disapproving those. So in terms of popular opinion, the project is basically, as I see it, in a free fall. And look at the other side of the ledger, capital, right? To my understanding, the only section of capital that's really behind Trump at this point is crypto. Every other section of capital is completely hostile to the tariffs idea, and we saw in kind of a brief moment the actual power that capital has in this project that's lurking underneath. What happened after the Trump so-called Liberation Day, right? Remember when he got out there and he had that stupid placard, and he had all those different wild tariff rates for all the different countries that he kind of that the administration came up with in a bizarre kind of way. There was a massive withdrawal of investments in the U.S. stock market, right? There was a huge swing in financial markets, and then what followed in the weeks after that was that there was massive lobbying on the part of hedge funds, on the part of businessmen. Tim Cook, basically Apple CEO, had a direct meeting with Trump saying, these tariffs are going to hurt our business. Trump reacted, said, okay, we're not going to put any tariffs on electronics. So we're basically seeing like the fact that this ethno-protectionist project is on really shaky terrains, not just in terms of popular opinion, right, but also in terms of capital, and in terms of the people that ostensibly have serious structural power in society. So I mean, that's kind of where I think we are in the project. And as the left, I think we need to start thinking about how to build alternative loci of power in this moment, not just in terms of our radical withdrawal of labor or withdrawal of civility in the case of protests, but in terms of building up different kinds of investment powers. I think if we were to look at sort of the broad swath of the past 40 years, the key crisis that has intensified decade after decade is a crisis of investment in care, a crisis of investment in ecological and green energy, a crisis of investment in infrastructure, a crisis of investment in community wealth, and the precarity that has led to a situation that we're in now, where it doesn't matter if you're a Trumpist or if you're a radical socialist, the common thread of opinion across the left and the right is that everybody hates big banks and large corporations. That's the result of this massive investment crisis that we're in. And I think in as a left and as folks that are trying to build an alternative, we really need to start to think seriously about how we can start building alternative that can basically deal with that long-term crisis. And so that's kind of how I see it. But I think we're in a very fragile moment, and I don't want to try to paint this as a rosy kind of picture. The fragility could lead to increased dangers. But I think the project that we see, the American state project, at least domestically, it's on kind of fragile terrain, and that's kind of how I would see it. And that was just my riff. That was my riff off of Jodi.
Thanks, Mike. We're moving on to another panel when we get to the crisis of investment. Let's go back to the right-wing project and its relation to Trump. I mean, the question one asks, as I said, is Trump the motor or the face of the right? Is he the intersection of various right projects that are not new, but have been around, let's say, since the Reagan era? Whether it's the financial right, it's the Christian nationalist right, it's and so forth. One really wonders too, I think, or I wonder, which policies that are being enacted are Trump's and which are Stephen Miller's and which are, Trump at the moment looks sort of like a mad king in some ways, who's clearly going through cognitive decline and is still very good at his own performative rift of kind of dominating the media moment with whoever he's talking with. But one wonders, other than tariffs, what his particular project is compared to the Heritage Project and the other things that are attached to him. So that would be one question I would nail at the moment. And, I want to add on the notion of the Fantasmagoria, the idea that the right is essentially reacting to an event that may happen in about 10 or 12 years, but hasn't happened yet, which is a strange situation.
Can I address that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Because I just don't believe it, really. I think I agree with the preventative framework. I really like Alberto's book, and I think that there is this phantasmagoric, aspect to it, but I don't think they have a far-seeing vision, and I don't think they're looking into the future. Maybe there's some people out there, some ideologists, but we have to be careful not to confuse, the ideologists and, what someone like Mark Andreessen says with the actual project itself. And there really isn't a vision, I don't think. This isn't what they're doing isn't coherent in many ways, and there are huge contradictions within the coalition that are going to have to shake out. So I think that there's a real danger of thinking of this as a kind of a grand conspiracy. And even if it were, as Mike says, it's going poorly. And they're really losing, partly because there isn't a plan. They had this kind of blitzkrieg strategy that's falling apart. It's losing in the courts. The tariffs are untenable. So, I think we have to be careful, not to attribute some kind of vision of a 1,000-year Reich to these people who are, largely clowns. And there's so many of them who are just kleptocrats, right? They're just, they don't care. They're just going to get rich. And that's a lot of what's going on. And Trump is a narcissist, right? So it's not really, he just wants people to like him. So
that's true. And I wasn't suggesting when I said that they're reacting to things that might happen in 10 years, that this represented a real project. I was putting this forward as a kind of phantasmagorical thing.
I think they're reacting to things right now. I think we already nailed it what it was. It absolutely
George
was.
Floyd. Okay. Yeah.
The social media of the 2010s and woke, and this kind of cultural change that was going on, this change in the kind of ethics and values of people, and particularly to reemphasize what Alberto said, is that it's the recuperation of these things by powerful organizations, by universities, by corporations, by, after Black Lives Matter, like every, Coca-Cola and every university and every, municipality issued some kind of statement about how they, opposed police brutality and, made these kinds of superficial attempts to kind of address anti-Black racism, right? And I think it's precisely that stuff which they're reacting against, because that's the stuff that's visible to them. But it's also they believe their own. They really do believe. They really do believe their own propaganda. They really do think there were Antifa buses, hired by George Soros. And this is, you really see this. You see how much they are actually deluded about the real consequences, which is why actually their ability to target people is actually fairly weak. They actually don't know what organization. They don't know anything about the left. You can see clearly with who they're going after in the universities. They're going after the most prominent and visible people, not the most radical. People like, Mahmoud Khalil and these were just the people who happen to be the most visible. So they don't really have a real understanding of they haven't mapped the centers of power, and they're so deluded by their own propaganda. They truly believe these kind of conspiracies that are, absolute hogwash.
But aren't they glomming together cultural power and political power? In other words, the cultural power is working towards their grievances as white men with Black Lives Matter and so forth, but they're transforming that in their minds to a Marxist control of the.
They need fascism. Fascism needs a sense of crisis, and that fascism is fundamentally a rescue project for capital. So it has to establish that there's some kind of crisis, and it's largely, in this preventive sense, it's largely a fictitious one. There wasn't a real challenge to capital in the 2010s, sadly.
I wonder.
I agree with that.
I wonder if, following on both from Jasper's very welcome points now, but also what Mike was saying before, if that sense of grievance and backlash against a kind of cultural revolution, so to speak, that also affected, as Jodi noted, created these, movements against tech, amongst tech workers, against the Maven project, against, working for ICE, etc. Yeah. Now, one of the reasons that this form of reaction has cohered in the way that it has is because these forms of venture and tech capital, one, involve absurd levels of personalized power and whim, right? In a way that's very unlike, the classic faceless, impersonal corporation of, mid-20th century stories about bureaucracy. But also that, these are forms of capital that depend massively on regulatory environments, right? On subsidies, including for EV cars in the case of Tesla. I mean, that, these are forms of accumulation that could be, undone by the stroke of a pen or of a law. I think, people in all of this big tech, for instance, were freaking out about even the more mild legislations in the European Union and so on and so forth, right? And they're extremely speculative. So just last week, I was writing this short piece about Palantir, and in the 3 days where I was looking through the edits, their market capitalization went up $40 billion, right? With no relationship to the actual revenues, though, of course, if you read the financial press, they get very excited about all their contracts for further repression and monitoring and so on. So I think there is something about those specific forms, right? Like, I think we also can, in thinking about the contradictions and the different fractions of capital that do and do not attach themselves to these projects, I think thinking about their specific organizational and financial forms seems to me significant. Yeah. And also thinking about, what are the broader limits within which these projects take place, right? Why is it that, of course, the tariffs on electric vehicles are not an invention of Trump, right? They were fully in place under Biden. The economic nationalism is not something that the far right has invented, right? So all of that material, I thought, Jamie Merchant's book was really useful in that regard, about thinking through the political economic continuities and limits within which then we also have these crazy variations in repression and rhetoric and so on. And I think we need to also tether our discussions to that, or else we just, become mesmerized, right? And mesmerized and paralyzed by the blitzkrieg clownish novelty of what's happening, which is significant at the level of repression, but has a very different relationship to the underlying political economy, I think.
I agree. And I think one aspect of this that didn't get mentioned is of the Trump coalition is the police. And that was an area where there were real substantial effects of the 2020 uprising and the pandemic in general, which caused police to retreat and stop prosecuting low-level crimes. And, California, people just shoplifted every day, all day long for years. And it was great for poor people. And so, there was a kind of weakening of police power in left liberal municipalities and universities. And I think what we've seen is a kind of counterattack and a reconsolidation of police power. And that's something that's really bipartisan. It's not, it's not just the Republicans. And especially out here, we have this kind of mostly Democratic oriented Silicon Valley constituency that is, fascist in its own ways. I mean, they're Democrats, but they want to, they basically want to just kill homeless people. And they're all about crime and property values. And they're, they're just sweeping encampments. And that's a kind of emergent thing here that's really led by the Democrats. And, or you look at Cop City, which was a project to persecute a movement that was a collaboration between Atlanta Democrats and MAGA Georgia State Republicans, and both groups were completely committed to this insane conspiracy theory about Antifa and money coming from the Democrats or things like that. So it's you know, and then you look at the Gaza protests, right? I mean, where, you know, essentially the Trump administration is just doing what university administrations wanted to do and have been doing. I mean, they started it, and Trump is really just finishing it off. And and that's why they have really no ground to stand on. And you know, they don't want it to go too far. But so, you know, I think that's really important to emphasize the continuities between you know, centrist Democrats and what's happening with Trump, especially around policing, because there's a kind of pro-police, anti-crime, you know, constituency that's grown in the last few years, and it's, you know, it's not just Republicans.
I was just thinking of the Kathy Hochul intervening to stop a Palestinian studies job, right, at CUNY. You know, I mean, all of that was in place long before the election.
That's right.
Jodi, you had something to say before?
Well, it's a little bit in a different direction, and it's about both the ideological dimension and the kind of phantasmagoria question. And essentially, I don't think either one of those are the right question, because they assume a kind of shared symbolic world of truth where they could be answered. And it strikes me that what's been unfolding and what we're seeing more is a world of power politics. And so, you know, we might want to say that the right is crazy and they have no sense of reality and everything is insane and blah, blah, blah. But I mean, they were together enough to build a coalition that could take every branch of government, get rid of the highest person in the military. They've got a lot of judges, right? Even though not all the judges are agreeing with them. And even though, you know, they're losing in some places, they're not necessarily following the judges' decisions. So they were able to actually, for all of their, you know, insanity, take state power, right? That's not nothing. That's a pretty remarkable. And to me, it shows, like, you know, God, it's actually, there are ways to imagine this. This is possible, right? It's not like the US bureaucracy and so-called checks and balances and all that doesn't necessarily stand up to anything. Now, we might say it's because they all already agree. I don't think that's a super satisfying answer, because I think it can explain, you know, some kind of sitting back, but I think that there's more disagreement than there is agreement, that the corruption of the Democratic Party was much more of a middle ground kind of thing. But, you know, but at the end of the day, I think paying attention to the fact that a group with a lot of different interests and different views coalesced enough to take power and to, you know, deport even American citizens, to you know, put the fear in major law firms that you would expect to stand up, to stop, to gut huge parts of the federal bureaucracy. I mean, that's not nothing. And that's not, I don't think we understand our own situation if we just write it off to sort of a crazy phantasmagoria.
But I think, you know, every historical right has always been divided, and it's come together from different strains. In France, in the 40s, you had the capitalist right with Laval. You had the fascist right, who were people in Paris like Brasiac and Céline and so forth. And then you had this kind of moral majority around Pétain that was trying to, you know, recreate a kind of ideal French peasant landscape and so forth. And, you know, I think that's always the case, where various strains of the right come together. And I don't think the notion of phantasmagoria is incompatible with the notion of maintaining an iron grip on power. I mean, the Nazis, when they were in power, still maintained some incredible fantasies, to the point where Goebbels sent, you know, expeditions to the poll to see if they could get to the hollow earth or things. I'm not trying to minimize the political effectiveness of the right, and maybe the thing to focus on a little bit is the absolute vacuum which occurred when the right essentially took state power here in America through a counter-revolution, where no laws are being obeyed, and where people are looking around and saying, well, who's opposing this? Who are, I'm not talking about, the professionals of opposition, the media and the Democratic Party and so forth. What's fascinating about the media is they always talk about a constitutional crisis as happening in the future. We may be on the road to a constitutional crisis. And they're saying this at a moment when nobody on the right is obeying any law. And it's like, as Aziz says, there's a constitutional collapse where all the kind of exceptions that have been carved out in the law for the last 30 years, all the arbitrations that corporations have forced to substitute for the law so that suddenly people don't get their day in court and so forth. Every kind of attempt to create tax laws that essentially get out of paying taxes, they create a situation where the rule of law is utterly hollow, whereas somebody says there are those who the law protects but doesn't bind, and there are the 90% who the law binds but doesn't protect. That's why it seems to me that a lot of times what happens is everything collapses in a second. That people were, at least the media was saluting every day with our democratic system of government and our system of rule of law. Suddenly people are looking around, and I'm talking about people who are just ordinary people and wanting there to be some strike back against Trump and not finding a mode to do it at that moment. I found that, it's like the fall of France, where what happened was the government went home when the Germans broke through, and there was nobody there for a long time until they formed the Vichy government, and people were looking around and saying, we had a government, it was the fourth power in the world, and suddenly this central government is not there. They don't know who to go to or who's going to be expressing their displeasure at what's happening. It seems like something like that happened here. That's my sense. Did anybody else have that sense that many people were looking around and wondering, what's the power that pushes back against this?
I mean, one thing that's striking to me is, and I'm sure this is not controversial in this audience, is the hollowness of liberalism in kind of creating this moment. I mean, we obviously know, I'm sure we all agree that the Democratic Party in the election, the message that the Harris campaign chose to run on was absolutely pathetic, and was no message to win any kind of working class vote off. But what's more striking to me in a way is the fact that a significant portion of Trump's main backers were themselves once liberals, come from essentially a liberal political background. Elon Musk at one point put environmentalism kind of front and center. Alex Karp at Palantir regularly says that he's a liberal, even though he's essentially working for the Department of Defense. Mark Zuckerberg. How do we explain that? How do we explain the fact that these individuals who literally bankrolled Trump's election, how do we explain the fact that they were themselves once politically liberal and they ended up where they are now? There's an interesting book out there. Actually, I think Alberto might have blurbed it. It's called The Japanese Ideology by Tosaka Jun. Did you blurb it? You did, right? It's really good. I highly suggest folks read it. It's this translation of this book that was written in I believe it was the 1930s. He's kind of had a similar he was Japanese Marxist that had somewhat similar trajectory as Gramsci. He kind of went to a fascist prison, died young, wrote about the rise of fascism in Japan, and kind of puts together this really interesting philosophy and theory, basically about how liberalism leads to fascism. Kind of talks about these three different forms of liberalism: economic, political, and cultural. And as the economic and political liberalism break down, you get this cultural liberalism that basically doesn't have any capacity to sort of fight against fascism. I'm just really giving the Cliff Notes version here. But the idea is that it doesn't provide a kind of ideological bulwark. And in a way, liberalism is always prone to these fascist shifts. And I think what we saw is, I mean, what we're seeing right now is the absolute hollowness of this entire political ideology. And we can see it so precisely in the shifts of these individuals who are now, I mean, is there anybody more ethno-fascist than Musk right now in the American political scene? He kind of embodies that. And I kind of going back to what I was saying before, I think that is precisely a reaction. Typically I'm just a hardcore materialist, and I say everything in economic reductionist terms. But I think in this case, it was a genuine reaction to the cultural defeat that these individuals suffered over the last 10 to 20 years. Not economic defeat. There was no loss of economic power, no loss, and not political defeat so much, but cultural defeat. Like their wealth and their position was increasingly seen by the people around them as illegitimate. To me, that's the heart of the story, is the hollowness of liberalism and why it basically provided a slip inside to where we are now.
And I think that it needs to be said, too, that has a lot to do with the fundamental fact of American decline, which is independent of liberalism and conservatism and the far right. And that, the reason why we see Trump, and even a way to understand Trump, is as a avatar of American imperial decline, and as a response to not just these cultural changes, I mean, perhaps more significantly, a response to the stagnation of American capitalism and a recognition of the kind of inability of the United States to project its power abroad, and the contradictions of the dollar system, which are, have both benefits and costs. And we know isn't going to be around forever. We know its days are numbered, and they're more numbered today than they ever were. And so I think that, in some way we can think of, Trump, this is what Trump and Biden share, is that they're both kind of Trump is a speed running the American decline, whereas, Biden was a kind of slower version of it. But that's why there's fundamental unanimity around economic nationalism, for example.
But I suppose that's also where I really I take that very much. I think what's interesting is thinking about why and how you get this flamboyant abandonment of the very idea of hegemony at a whole set of scales, right? Like both the notion that even these tried and true mechanisms of the infinite Cold War, like
USAID, right? I mean,
USAID, etc. So blowing up the very infrastructure of soft power and hegemony, and doing so, not just deliberately, but as a kind of show. As well as, and you can think of even internally, like we were discussing, the liberal co-optation and partial reform in the wake of the George Floyd uprisings and other forms of social movement. Those two, right? Like they're forms of of it, if not hegemony proper, then at least efforts to co-opt and pacify subaltern and oppositional forces. So this idea that you now both internally and externally just go for dominance, right? And that not only you go for dominance, but you go for dominance that says that that's what it is, right? That you will, and that the discourse is openly transactional. So even if it comes to nothing, there is something symbolically meaningful about taking the economic nationalism, and the stagnation, which I think you're totally right, are a given. I keep thinking of the fact that when Emanuel Wallerstein wrote, was it in 2003, the decline of American power, I think 2025 was like the year of by which time it's going to play out. But I think it matters, right? It matters but part of the reason I think why this is working is because of how feeble, how anemic the late stage, Cold War nostalgia, progressive neoliberal Biden-Harris moment went. How devoid of any power, and how also morally and politically bankrupt it was shown to be by Gaza, right? And so I think that was also obviously what allowed this shift in the same economic and political horizon into this rather reckless mode, right? Because explicitly abandoning hegemony is a fairly reckless move, including a reckless move for American capitalism, as shown by the responses that were already mentioned by you and Mike to the tariffs, right?
So I think two dimensions of this. One, this kind of fascinating struggle between the national security state and certain parts of the right and Trump. The idea being that a lot of for example, the agencies like aid that Trump was attacking were actually horrible in the Cold War in terms of putting money into Italy to fund anti-communist candidates in elections and so forth. So we have this story as it's presented in the media of these great agencies that help expand American prestige in the world, and what our knowledge of studying of some of these is. So there's that crazy struggle that's going on. Well, I'll just throw that one out and see what people's reaction to that. Well, the other thing I would say is the notion that all we need is a CEO to run the state and they would make it efficient, because private industry is always 100 times more efficient than a state and so forth. They managed to get absolutely the worst businessman in the world to head the state, someone who essentially has lived on subsidies all his life and escaping laws and getting rent for $1 for 40 years at someplace in New York for a hotel. And the guy is trying out the strategy of private equity, which is to just go in with a chainsaw, cut everything, and and we haven't seen the full effects come out. But one wonders if, in fact, it's going to send everything into the toilet, as seems likely, how that will amplify or spread or disseminate among people who are looking at Trump's words and supposed TV efficiency as a businessman to provide a better future for them, particularly all of the small businesses that are dependent on these things that are being tariffed through the roof, that have no place to go but out of business, it seems to me, in a long time. I mean, again, that's trying to think the future, but all of those forces seem to be in play.
Yeah.
This makes me think, Philip, about Mike's point on Trump's, rapidly declining polls, because the only people doing worse in the polls than Trump are the Democrats. And so it doesn't really, if it kind of doesn't matter exactly how bad he is, if we're talking about electoral politics and the only alternative is a Democrat where they seem utterly like they don't have anybody, and anybody that they might bring up seems, really, really awful. Like as in like just incompetent, banal, deluded, condescending, obsequious. And so I think like for us, then the question is, given how the fact that nobody likes either of the mainstream parties, how do we use this as an opportunity for the left? Like how do we like this is an opportunity, and it seems very difficult to take and very hard to think about, and something it's easier for us, where it's much easier for us to criticize and deflect and to look at the problems with everybody else. But I think the real task is, how do we use this opportunity? And one of the things that I just always find like a problem. I always feel like, God, it's like the left ends up in the position where we're either opportunist or accelerationist, right? We're opportunist if we support the Democrats, and we're accelerationist if we don't, because what we are seeing is things getting worse, rapidly worse, with the Republican administration. But I think how we capitalize on this moment is the question that we need to think about.
Yes. Anybody have any ideas there?
Well, I don't have any ideas, but I have some thoughts about why we haven't seen a very vigorous response to Trump in the first 100 days. I mean, I think first off is that a lot of people who were around for 2016 went into the new Trump administration with a commitment not to kind of take the bait, and a recognition that sometimes, there were mobilizations in 2016 that actually like helped the far right to mobilize, right? And that had especially to do with these kind of street confrontations, which gave a lot of these people in the streets something to push against. And eventually the movement won, but I think there was an awareness that, a desire not to fall into that. So a lot of people are kind of waiting and biding their time. And then I also think there's the problem with the Democrats and the just the absolute hatred that they've engendered on the left, and that people really don't want to get caught up with them and don't want to support them as the pole of resistance. But they're not doing anything. So I think that problem is dealt with itself. It's like they're not really, they don't have this capacity. They're just not there. But what you saw in 2020 was they, with the George Floyd uprising, they ignored it, then they lied about it, and then they recuperated it, and so like far after the fact. And so I think people are anxious about that. And then the other thing I think is that there's been a lot of organization happening on the left that just is not particularly well suited to this moment. And people are good at, like, there's a lot of kind of base building projects and things like that, but they're not particularly, the temporality of those projects isn't particularly suited to this kind of situation. And so there's capacity for organization, but mobilization, which is maybe what's called for to a certain extent right now, there's less capacity for that, partly because the left has kind of reacted against a kind of a hyper orientation towards mobilization. And, say what you will about the DSA space, it does not seem capable of doing that at all. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that they've kind of occupied a center that used to be occupied by other groups, kind of weird anarchists and things like that, I think that really changes things. And there's a kind of, and so, mostly you get these weird, sects or cults, like calling things. And so, but I also think like that it's going to take time. And I think the response is building, and that we'll see something soon.
Can I ask?
Really hopeful stuff happening. The Sackett's Harbor thing. There's been these little kind of moments that are, very, very hopeful. Really, just kind of, spontaneous, kind of proletarian resistance.
Can I ask a question, partly as somebody who's obviously not in the U.S. And not in the U.S. left, therefore, I suppose what I was wondering in terms also of the theme that we've discussed and of the preventive dimension, right, or the anticipatory dimension. So we're only a few months into this administration, and it seems just like statistically inevitable that at some point before its end, something will kick off somewhere, right? And it just seems a kind of given.
Right.
So I was, yeah. So I was sort of, wondering a couple of things. What people's sense is of what relationship existing forms of collectivity and organization at all sorts of scales might have to that, also in view of the, if not lessons, at least experiences in living memory of past mobilizations, but also, I suppose what that will mean. I mean, Jasper, you talked about, the centrality of the police also to this, Trump 2 project, right? One of the things that's been very evident also, and part of the reason why I'm not in Seattle is that there's a lot of, there's a whole structure of license and permission that's built in. So people are doing like crazy stuff at the border that goes way above what normal procedure would be, right? Often against people who are not even like posing, particular kind of risks or a flag, like French space scientist or whatever. So, so I was just wondering about a sense of how do we not like forecast, but get a sense of the way in which the existing forces and agents might kind of crystallize around that. And I suppose the other aspect, which is in a sense a little bit more quotidian and perhaps a little bit more reformist, and again I'm asking because I don't know, if there's a sense of, obviously people are resisting at local level all sorts of dimensions of this administration and what it's related to, but if there's anything that looks like forms of coordination or articulation that don't go through this husk of the Democratic Party, whether in terms of solidarity movements, labor movements, etc., that find some maybe local forms of organization that have durability, even just at the level of like defending certain spaces or defending certain forms of organization.
Yeah, I've been thinking along those lines too, and the thing I'm musing about is thinking about the French resistance and essentially how it formed, because nothing could seem more hopeless or desperate than having to construct something when the Nazis were occupying the country or the Vichy government. And one of the first things about the resistance that's interesting is none of the former parties or movements controlled it. When it finally got a structure, it was a structure that was created with people who had been in some of those parties or some of those labor movements, but they entered as individuals. The people who were going to resist found each other when they made a council of resistance. And one of the things I was trying to think about, what would be an equivalent when I looked at that Liz Cheney falsification that had been circulating on the web about 7 forms of strategy that people could take. There was this one notion of creating a civilian tribunal with representatives from various areas. And that took me back to the Vietnam War, where Bertrand Russell and Jean-Paul Sartre were part of a tribunal that essentially had Vietnamese who had been napalmed would come and testify before it. And it had a huge effect because it had a huge effect on the university population. I think, in America and so forth, because these were the two most famous philosophers in the world at that time. So I think the notion of creating a tribunal that literally put out counter news in a performative way, giving press conferences or something, and that literally indicted people and kept their crimes and the laws they had broken in a kind of some kind of kind of file, with the notion that there wouldn't be just a Truth and Reconciliation Commission at the end of this. There would be a Nuremberg account, and that everybody, we'll see you at Nuremberg, they would sign off with. In other words, doing a fairly aggressive attempt to say that you're all criminals and you will be held accountable. If there was a way to set up something like that and put it in a friendly state where the governor was likely to deal with any kind of Trumpian overreach to shut down this particular tribunal. Anyway, it's an idea I tossed out where I thought, what is an instrument where one could strike back and absorb people from the various notions? So I throw that out as an idea. Is there any validity to it, or is it?
There were a couple of groups, including the Progressive International, that arranged the Belmarsh Tribunal to defend Julian Assange, and there were a couple of different events that they had and brought leftists together from a variety of countries to make statements on behalf of Assange and bring, to do the same kind of illuminating work that you're describing. So I think that, there's even a more recent example than the one that you're bringing up. I want to just add in a couple of other points. Like Alberto mentioned that there has been resistance and fight back since the different kinds of Trump maneuvers and Musk maneuvers, all over the country. Lots, particularly in small towns and suburban areas, people who've never been active, folks who are generally kind of middle of the road, coming out because they're upset about cuts to veterans benefits. They're upset about the threat to Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. They're fighting a defensive struggle, but they're out in the streets. I mean, and that's pretty amazing. In the kind of places where I live, this, like, folks are out on the streets almost every Saturday, and we're talking like large numbers, like hundreds in small communities who are really unhappy and fighting back. And I mean, maybe it's not, it's not the most radical people at all, but it's folks who, who are fed up. I also, on that score, maybe something even more kind of akin to what I hope we'll continue to see. There were 12 or 14 farm workers who were arrested by ICE here in upstate New York, about two and a half hours from me, a little past Buffalo. These farm workers were actually trying to organize their workplace for the United Farm Workers. And so in the fight back in defense of them, you have coming together the union, the UFW, and then the kind of more radical left political parties, and a lot of the immigrants' rights groups are coming together. That's interesting. It's a rural or hinterland kind of struggle, agricultural, and also workplace organizing and immigration all at once. So one of the interesting possibilities, I think, from the flooding the zone right-wing tactic is it does create more possible combinations of constituencies for initial fight back, and then building the kind of connections that we need to move from just a defensive struggle to an offensive struggle on the left.
Kind of building off that a little bit, one kind of quasi set of tribunals that we've seen quite dramatically over the past couple of years have been the student encampments that have popped up around college campuses in the US. I mean, not tribunals in the traditional sense, but these were spaces where students were coming together, often with faculty, to have educationals, but also, I think more importantly than that, to pressure universities to redirect investments in crucial ways. And yeah, I think going forward, movements like that can link up with labor, that can link up beyond the university. That's really what I'm most hopeful for. I mean, there's been a funny way in which I've kind of had to relearn all the Trotskyist lessons I've forgotten over the past 2 decades. With the failures of Occupy Wall Street and what we saw happen in Black Lives Matter, there was this, and what we saw with the Bernie campaign, there was a political kind of experience that I had over the past decade or so, where I was less and less focused on organization, local organization, being a part of groups that hold you accountable, that you can show up to, that you can actually work together with. I became more excited about mass mobilizations, the kind of experience of like going to something through a social media event and seeing thousands of people show up, or the hope of having somebody run on sort of quasi-socialist ideas and seeing those ideas actually popular. I think the kind of organization in a way that we have seen on college campuses with student organizations, but also increasingly outside of the university in terms of labor, although labor is on the university as well. I think that to me is what I'm like most hopeful for. I'm kind of, it's the hammer and the piston and the all that stuff.
I want to take some questions, and in fact, you're answering like the first question, so we can continue. The question is, which social forms, points of struggles, and modes of resistance do you think hold the most potential for some ways out of this moment, which we're currently talking with at the moment? So we'll continue with that, and I'll give one more question afterwards. Anybody have more to say about this?
I mean, I think the form of the Revolutionary Party is indispensable. I mean,
Jasper, revolution being the topic you've sunk your head in for many years now?
Well, I think that in some ways the initiating germ with things like this is often unpredictable. It's probably going to take something that catches in a particular way and enables people to kind of organize around it in a way where they don't feel like they're going to get swept up by the Democrats. And so I think that people are probably just kind of waiting for the kind of moment of the thing that becomes something that people can mobilize around nationwide. And then it's really about coming together and figuring out how to extend the social movement and make it more powerful and intensify it and extend it and spread it. And there's lots of organizational forms for that, different ways to coordinate.
Okay.
I do think.
Oh, Mike?
Just something very small. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jasper.
I hear a lot of people talking about forming cadre organizations and things like that too. So I think there's already a lot of interest in that, and we'll probably see things like that. I think those, they can only grow at a certain rate, though. They're not capable of. You need extra party organizations for the kind of temporality that we're looking at.
I guess I just wanted to say for something very, very briefly. The one thing I would say is the left shouldn't fetishize particular tactics, whether it be strikes or protests or whatever the case might be. In my view, the fundamental thing about capitalist development with respect to class is that it creates increasing differentiation within the working class, which creates a wide range of different kinds of demands and different kinds of concerns and grievances. And in any given moment, it's a whole wide range of possible areas where things could pop off. And the one thing that I've seen the left do over and over again is when something happens and it's not in their model of how like the revolution should happen, people are quick to criticize these things. But I think we need to have a little more flexibility around what the working class is and where the movements emerge in the kind of days ahead.
Okay. Here's another question. So, revolution, changing one system for another, involves breaking the laws, and in fact, throwing out a system of laws and replacing them with the other. What we have now, or what the right is doing, is literally not obeying any of the laws, not just not answering subpoenas, but doing things that are totally illegal. One imagines that the liberal response to this, should there ever be a kind of a pendulum swing of government, is to rewrite the laws so that breaking them will even have stiffer consequences. In other words, what I'm saying is, so if you rewrite laws based on the insurrection of January 6th, it means that in the future, if there is a moment when the left, for reasons that are much more socially defendable than what the right was doing at the time, engages in activity which invokes those laws, the effect is going to come down hard on the head of the left. And we might suspect that the reaction to what Trump is doing, the pendulum, will be an attempt to also tie our hands when we try to do what this last experience of Trump has demonstrated conclusively, that we do not live under a rule of law, and that we have to come up with a new one that sort of works for everybody. How do you see that playing out in the future?
I think it's risky. Well, as well as, I think kind of empirically incorrect to just argue that since January, the U.S. has entered some kind of, pure state of exception or illegality and so on. I think the situation is far more complex, not least because, forms of, executive power and ways of bypassing the courts have been part and parcel of the U.S. order for a long time, especially as concerns the national security state. I think we have very strange and short memories, and I think we underestimate, the effect of repeated intensifications of executive power, police power, national security power, etc., right, on what is just normal in the United States polity as well as in other ones, right? So, I don't think the U.S. has entered some kind of situation in which, the courts don't exist or don't matter and so on. But it is, of course, a space where there is a much more explicit willingness to flout, to ignore, but then also to retroactively try to make things legal that weren't, including by the Supreme Court itself, vis-a-vis presidential immunity and so on and so forth. So, and I think it's important to do that because I think otherwise, one ends up in this bizarre retroactive fantasy of what the rule of law was, or of what liberalism was, and then one misunderstands what the U.S. constitutional order and legal apparatus and repressive apparatus makes possible and has always made possible, right? So the idea that a kind of full rupture or break has taken place, I don't find convincing. And I think, there's many ways to boil a frog, and we're seeing some of them, but, they don't necessarily involve abandoning the legal domain by any means, right? So I think that's very significant, and that's why, you know, just like we saw with like John Yoo and Bush Jr., we're also seeing people that are, you know, lawyers that are trying to figure out how you can make like parts of the CCOT, El Salvadorian concentration camp, U.S. territory, so that you can deport, you know, citizens there, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not, you're never leaving the terrain of law and of the uses of law for just pure whim. I think that just does not seem for me to speak to how things are operating, whilst not, you know, not underestimating the fact that this, you know, the open break, the, well, do I really have to defend the Constitution, et cetera? Of course, these things are significant. And I think also we, you know, like you mentioned, Philip, in terms of things like, you know, People's Tribunal or, you know, our carceral desires, which many times I share, at least at an effective level. I think there's a risk, right, also of getting caught up in that like symbolic politics of retribution. And, you know, and also because I think we forget that people have all sorts of very ambivalent and at times very hateful, quite rightly so, relationships to the law, right? And to what the rule of law has done to them in the past. And I think the fact, you know, I think Trump gained a lot from all of those prosecutions, right, in many ways. And there were a lot of fantasies about the fact that, oh, he's a felon, you know, all of that. I think there's a lot of fantasies about the law that the left needs to traverse, to be quite lucid about how to navigate that space, which is significant, right? It's significant what's happening in terms of trying to get, you know, students who are being deported back to, you know, Vermont instead of Louisiana. All of those things matter. They're actual struggles, you know, but I think we need to do so without the fetishes, right? The fetish that there is this thing called the rule of law that has now been exited and that we want to return, I think is tend to really into Democratic Party ideology. And after all, the Democratic Party is the party of ideology, I think, in the US, because it believes its own story much more than the other side.
Let me push back for a second. I agree with what you're saying. And it's not quite, I didn't express myself perhaps as well as I should of. There's a fantasy of a constitution in America. Aziz talks about that, Aziz Rana in his book, Veneration of the Constitution. America's the only country in the world that actually is supposed to love this particular set of instructions as how to govern. And the notion, Madison's notion was, it's a machine that goes of itself. It doesn't depend on the virtue of the various people in power. Power checks counterpower, counterpower checks power, you know, and it functions. Well, all right. It's obvious it has never done that, and has never done that. And, you know, judges in the Supreme Court have found ways of making their whims into law for a long time. It didn't even start with this court, you know, whether it's Dred Scott or wherever we want to go, anywhere in the 19th century. Lochner, it's been going around. So, but the question is this. I don't think there has ever been a moment where the scale of the ignoring of law, flooding the zone, as the Trump people have, has just, you know, everything from Gestapo kidnappings to firing all these people in ways that were illegal to, you know, people have noticed it in a way that they haven't noticed any of these slimy decisions before. And it may be, in fact, that the will of the press and the liberal Democrats is to kind of move us back towards that fantasy of having the perfect constitution where everything that's happened will be ignored and forgotten. And maybe that's even the most likely result of what's happening. But what's happening, what will happen. But I feel at any rate that that, you know, the responses you've heard, not from professionals of this or that, but kind of ordinary people, at the scale is it's something that's been noticed, and it's created a feeling of anxiety in a lot of people. So that's all I was asking, whether in fact the likelihood is that they would move back to the fantasy of a law that functions fairly and so forth once you get rid of Trump, or whether there's some way, or whether it's even important to build on this so that we don't create a kind of foreclosed situation for kind of leftists' actions, which may look, according to liberal formalism, identical to what the right did, but are not, because they're designed to open up a closed system. That's all I was trying to frame as a question. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Does anybody else have any more comments that we can sort of end with, or think about, or questions to take home?
Maybe just very briefly, I was recently reading a kind of newer translation of Gramsci's Notebook 25, which is the notebook on subaltern social groups. And there's a line in there that I was really struck by, where he says something along the lines of, I'm paraphrasing because I can't remember the quote exactly, the struggle of subaltern groups is a struggle of becoming a state. And he doesn't say becoming the state or being incorporated into the state, or but becoming a state. And I kind of interpret that, to go to your point about the constitutional order, the legal framework. I think to draw from that a little bit, the left and progressives more broadly should be talking about introducing legal frameworks into the spaces of societies where capital runs free. And that, to me, is kind of the idea of becoming a state for the working class. So I guess I'm not really, the kind of breaking of the constitutional order. I think a more positive framework is just think about how do we extend democracy, both in terms of the process. Obviously, democratic process in the state is completely in shambles. But in terms of the scope, like what is covered under the range of things that we make deliberative judgments about, and that to me is kind of a more positive framework for thinking about the horizons of the left. I don't know, just a thought.
It's too bad we don't have Camila here, Camila Vergara, because her book is essentially about institutionalizing a form of dual power, creating plebeian power outside the state. And we don't want to get into get Jasper on Gramsci or Jodi on democracy. So, because that's a whole other panel that we could talk about sometime. So I think we should maybe stop here. I want to thank everybody. I found it quite interesting to listen to, and I hope everybody who saw it, some of you will see later online. And Jasper, I'm really looking forward to seeing you in person. I'm putting aside some math books for you. I just want you to know I haven't forgotten. Great. Alberto, so close and yet so far. And Mike, it's fun. It's fun to meet you. Jodi, always a pleasure.
Yeah, it's good to
luck,
meet
everybody, and have a good
Jodi,
day.
good to see you, Alberto.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye.